All right, so now let's talk about the kind of last major part of the luteal phase, which is luteolysis. So some characteristics of luteolysis is, first and foremost, we will see a decrease in progesterone secretion from the CL. And so that corpus luteum, once it is targeted by prostaglandin F2 alpha, it's going to start the death process. And we're going to look at what that looks like on a cellular level here in just a few minutes. So because luteolysis is occurring, we're going to see a decrease in progesterone, we're going to see a major loss of luteal tissue mass, and we're going to see that removal of negative feedback on the hypothalamus. And so in order for luteolysis to take place, the uterus has to be in place. And so we also have a few other requirements. The uterus not only has to be in place, but there also has to be the presence of oxytocin receptors on cells in the endometrial layer of the uterus. And we have to make sure that we have a critical level of oxytocin cells that are going to be produced by those large luteal cells. And finally, prostaglandin F2 alpha has to be synthesized by the endometrial layer. And so all of these things have to come together and be in place for luteolysis to be successful. All right, so let's talk about a quick study that was described in your book. And so the way that we found out that the uterus is absolutely necessary for luteolysis to take place was through several subsequent research studies done in the 70s and the 80s. And so this is a figure out of your book. And in the first figure here, we've got a uterus that is completely intact. We haven't surgically removed anything. And so we've got a corpus luteum that is going to be on the right ovary here. And on the left ovary, there's no corpus luteum, but the uterus is fully intact at this point. And so we know through studying hormonal profiles, dissecting uterine tissue, etc., that if a female has a uterus that is intact, the lifespan of the CL is going to be the same as a normal cycle, so 15 to 17 days. Now, if we were to go into a female and do a complete uterectomy, meaning that we would take out all of the uterine tissue, so the uterus as well as the uterine horns, and that CL was still on the right ovary, we would actually find that in sheep, so this is a sheep study that this was done with, the total urectomy would actually extend the life of the CL to what would normally be a gestation length in the sheep, so about 148 days. So that CL wouldn't regress on its own without a uterus in place for 148 days. In another set of sheep, we found out that if you have the CL still on the right ovary there, and did a partial uterectomy of the uterus or the uterine horn and the uterine material that is on the opposite side of where the CL is, so contralateral, you would end up with a CL that has a similar lifespan to a normal cycle. And so that CL would actually regress in 15 to 17 days, which is very similar to a fully intact uterus. Okay. Really interestingly, though, we also found that in a group of sheep, if we did a partial uterectomy, that it was ipsilateral, so on the same side that the CL was on. A partial uterectomy ipsilateral to the CL would actually cause that corpus luteum to have a lifespan longer than normal, so longer than the normal 15 to 17 days. That CL would live for about 35 days. And so the take-home message here is that First and foremost, the uterus absolutely has to be intact for successful, timely luteolysis to take place. If it's not intact, the CL is going to stick around for a normal gestation length. The second interesting piece of information here is that there's some cross signaling that is taking place. So we know that if the side of the uterus that is left intact, that is on the same side as the CL, that communication is actually enhanced. And so the CL is going to be in place for a normal period of days. However, if we leave the side of the uterus that is intact, that is opposite of the CL, it is going to take a little bit longer for that hormonal signal to get from that side of the uterus over to the CL here. So it takes about an extra 15 days for that to happen. And so position of the uterus, as well as having the uterus in place, is really a key part to this luteolysis process. All right, so let's talk about what this looks like from a hormonal standpoint. And so for the next couple of slides, you're going to see this graph here. And this is really key to the production scenario as well, which is why we see Alejandro's picture on this slide. So to orient you to the way that this graph is set up, the days of the estrus cycle is going to be on the y-axis, or the x-axis down here. And notice we aren't looking at a full cycle. We're looking at about day 13 to day 19. Okay, on the y-axis over here, we actually have the prostaglandin F2 alpha level. And then on the z-axis over here to the right, we have the progesterone level. And so what we end up seeing here is that the progesterone level towards the end of diestrus, so day 13, 14, and 15, is going to be very, very high. And then it's going to start to taper off around day 15 and a half, 16, and 17. And so we know that the hormone levels are going to go through that familiar pattern. Also, the sorry, I think I called this side prostaglandin over here. It is prostaglandin. Oh, I know what there we go. Okay. So the x-axis is really looking at the amount of messenger RNA that is in place. And if we have messenger RNA, then we know that we have a gene that is being upregulated. And in this case, it's oxytocin. And so those oxytocin receptors are starting to become more prolific as we see diestrus move into luteolysis. So when progesterone is high, we have a few oxytocin receptors in place. However, as soon as progesterone starts to decrease, the amount of oxytocin receptors that we see in the uterus automatically increases. And then while progesterone is low, we see even more increase of oxytocin receptors. So let's then lay the amount of prostaglandin F2 alpha over the top of that. So prostaglandin F2 alpha, keep in mind, is coming from the endometrial layer of the uterus, and it is being produced in response to a lack of a pregnancy attaching to the uterine wall. So when that happens, interferon tau is then going to be absent, which is going to upregulate prostaglandin F2 alpha. Because that internal system is basically like, okay, there's no pregnancy here. We've got to start this whole cycle again and try to get a pregnancy. So prostaglandin F2 alpha to the rescue. And so as we start to see a decrease in progesterone, we start seeing an increase in oxytocin receptors. And at the same time, we see an increase in the pulsatility of prostaglandin F2 alpha being produced from the endometrial layer of the uterus. And so prostaglandin F2 alpha starts pulsing at higher levels clear back here, even when progesterone is still pretty high. And so it's doing this in response to no pregnancy being detected. So the lack of interferon tau and PGF2 alpha starts this whole luteolysis process. So once it starts pulsing, that signals that there's no pregnancy in place. PGF2 alpha is gonna start traveling to the corpus luteum on the ovary, and progesterone is gonna start decreasing in response to that CL starting to die. And once the CL starts to die, it loses tissue mass, it stops producing progesterone. We see an increase in oxytocin receptors and even more pulsativity of prostaglandin F2 alpha. All right, so now that we have a good understanding of what the hormone sequence really looks like, let's look at what's going on at the cellular level. So in the corpus luteum cells, so the large and the small corpus luteum cells, here on the ovary, we have a receptor for prostaglandin F2 alpha already in place. And so when prostaglandin F2 alpha is produced in response to there not being a pregnancy, it is going to bind to its receptor and it's going to kick off a series of events. Event number 1 is where we see the binding of PGF2 alpha, changing the conformation of this receptor and opening a calcium channel. So calcium ions are going to rush into the cell, and that increase in calcium is going to cause apoptosis or cell death to happen. At the same time that happens, the second action that we see is we're going to see protein kinase C be upregulated through the same secondary messenger system that we talked about previously. And protein kinase C here is then going to stop the enzymatic conversion of cholesterol to progesterone. And so we're going to then see progesterone stop being produced at this point in time. And so we're going to see a decrease in progesterone, and we're going to see that cell start to die all at the same time. And so that's what's happening at the cellular level during this luteolysis process here. So I just wanted to bring those concepts together for you.